Good morning, everyone. Great. I'm Mabel Wilson. I'm the Associate Director of IRAAS, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I was just commenting to Adrienne Brown. I feel like with that music, I should have a cocktail, or at least Bloody Marys for everyone. But I want to just say welcome to our third day of celebration of the 25 years of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, an institution dedicated to, as its founder Mabel envisioned, the teaching and research of the diversity of Black experiences in the global diaspora. Free to be anywhere in the universe celebrates that legacy, but also continues IRAAS's public mission to understand the past, critically engage the here and the now, and to imagine what Black futures lie before us. So I want to say that the conference opened on Thursday evening with Dr. Kelly Jones in conversation with South African artist Mary Sibande, whose first solo show in New York is currently on view at the Leroy Neiman Gallery in Dodge Hall on the main campus of Columbia, beyond the gates of 116th and Broadway. So I encourage all of you over lunch to go see Sibande's powerful homage to the beauty and resolve of Black women. Now, yesterday's panel took us on a remarkable through line across genealogies of Black studies, to diasporic politics, and onto a provocative theoretical turn in Black studies. Those of you who were here last night were treated to a lively conversation between scholar Tina Camp and filmmaker Arthur Mpho, who shared 3 of his timely works on the state of Blackness in America, including the monumental Love is the Message is Death. Today opens with Black urban life, followed by this afternoon's panels on the global Black feminisms and imaging freedom. Tonight, please join us at the Harlem stage for Come On in the Prayer Room, an immersive performance by Imani Uzuri, who I recently had the pleasure of hearing her magisterial voice in a piece by artist Carrie Mae Weems. So it's not to be missed. It starts at 6:30, 150 Convent Avenue at the Harlem stage. It's just 12-minute walk from here, so it's not to be missed. And so I just want to say before we move on in the conference, we owe a debt of gratitude to the hard work of the organizing committee, especially Robert Gooding-Williams, my colleagues who helped brainstorm today's event a year ago at our annual retreat. This impressive gathering would not be possible without the logistical magic of Sean Mendoza and Sharon Harris, who always keep it moving. And please join me in thanking the stalwart vision of Kelly Jones and the grace and leadership of Farah Griffin, who's the director of IRAAS. Okay, so now I'm shifting to panel director mode. So I'm actually going to go sit and introduce the panel. Okay, nope, it's not on yet. Hello? Is it on? Yeah, it's weird, you can't hear it from back here. So yesterday, Christina Sharp considered how soil holds the matter and memory of Black peoples. And thinking through this question, she asked us to consider, quote, how Black people are making life in space, end quote. That question resonates in the work of our first panel that will take measure of Black urban life across transdisciplinary, planetary, and spirit work, which is being done by our esteemed panel, Adrienne Brown, Mindy Fullilove, Mpho Matsipa, and Deborah Thomas. So we're going to begin with Adrienne. Adrienne is an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago. She is the author of The Black Skyscraper, Modern Architecture and the Shape of Race and Writing, which was published by Johns Hopkins in 2017, a really innovative and I think critically important book. And she also co-edited with Valerie Smith, Race and Real Estate with Oxford University Press. She's currently working on a project that looks on race and mass home ownership, of which I think she's going to give us an excerpt today. So, Adrienne.
Great. Everyone can hear me okay? Yeah? All right. I'm so pleased to be here. Again, thanks to everyone who brought us together. Thank you, Mabel. I'm just really happy to be here. My talk today is from a new project that attempts to recapture the ways mass homeownership remade processes of racial formation, valuation, and perception while recovering writerly experiments with alternatives to mass homeownership touted in the early 20th century as a civic, moral, and racial imperative. As I think thickly about race, property, and perception in this new work, I find myself indebted again and again to work by IRAAS scholars and alum on movement and migration, intimacy's manifold forms, sound and performance, and the racialized histories of architecture and real estate. I considered trying to call out all of those genealogies and debts, but then I had no time to give my talk, but hopefully you'll recognize and hear those debts even without my gesturing. Okay. So Herbert Hoover's 1931 presidential address to the White House Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership was filled with songs. Despite the meeting's social science emphasis, Hoover wielded song lyrics as evidence of homeownership's naturalness and necessity. And I'm going to read from the top of this. There is a wide distinction between homes and mere housing. Those immortal ballads, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and The Little Gray Home in the West, were not written about tenements or apartments. They are the expressions of racial longing, which find outlet in the living poetry and songs of our people. The president then wryly contended that Americans, quote, never sing songs about a pile of rent receipts. At the time, Hoover was 10 years into his project of property boosterism, which he first began as Secretary of Commerce in 1919. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, bureaucrats like Hoover believed that homeownership was America's greatest defense against the communist revolution arriving on native shores. Thus began the state's efforts in promoting homeownership as not just a savvy financial move, but as an innate yearning at the heart of American identity. And this slide is from the Delineator advertising one of the first big public-private partnerships to boost homeownership, the Better Homes in America campaign. And you can kind of see Hoover's editorial over there. But the cultural tradition that Hoover invoked in 1931 proved far more vexed than his selective stroll through the National Songbook suggested. His remarks sidestepped a whole host of American cultural production being sung to a different tune, including, which will be my focus today, the rent parties, where Black writers and musicians were, in fact, turning rent receipts into song. As Hoover was delivering his housing speech, much of the country was learning the new dances that were coming out of parties in northern Black enclaves. These partygoers were producing exactly what Hoover omitted, odes to being housed that did not glorify houses or ownership as such. Rent parties provided tutorials on dispossessing possession for Black migrants most shut out of state-sponsored property initiatives. Hoover's selective songbook reflects the racialization of ownership at the turn of the 20th century as a particularly white capacity. Hoover's claiming of the home-centric songs of our people as expressions of racial longing was the culmination of 2 decades of assertions by realtors that Anglo-Americans had developed a singular aptitude for this mode of dwelling, surpassing even their European ancestors. And I won't have time to talk about that, but it's part of this chapter is kind of recovering the racialized philosophy of Anglo capacity for home ownership that realtors are really thinking through in their own kind of journals and publications from 1908 to 1920. So even before we kind of get into the New Deal and some of the federal policies that subsidize mass home ownership for whites, that the philosophical foundation of that was emerging in realtor discourse, intersecting with racist science discourse. Scholars have studied the racial covenants, zoning ordinances, and neighborhood violence used to maintain residential segregation as law for decades and as practice for much longer. But less well studied is the degree to which the arguments made by the first generation of professional realtors for mass home ownership were racialized from their earliest conceptualization. So in the time that I have left, I want us to tune into what Hoover's songbook omits. Rent party throwers, attenders, and describers imagine dwelling not as a racial virtue, but as a burdensome requisite that must be secured but not necessarily celebrated. Against Hoover's insistence on the broad moral distinction between home and mere housing, rent parties featured tenants reveling in the joys of mere housing, sometimes by fostering other modes of dwelling, transforming housing into home, and at other times by refusing the concept of home altogether for more diffuse, mobile, and temporary relational forms of shelter. Okay. So while the rent party has its roots in Southern church socials and fish fries, it emerged as a distinctive form in the northern cities to which blacks migrated en masse in the early 20th century. Peaking in popularity in the 1920s and 30s, parties helped working class residents to afford inflated rents in dense black enclaves where renters paid as much as 50% more for housing than their white urban counterparts. Known for good music, hearty food, bad liquor, low lights, close dancing, late nights, and the occasional violent lover spat, rent parties encouraged attendees to let loose while helping their neighbors avoid dispossession for another month. There are no extant recordings of the rent party sounds and sights. What we know about these functions largely derives from the writings and recordings of the jazz greats who forged their personas there, and historians who've written about them, a handful of renderings in literature and art, belated autobiographical recollections, police reports, and salacious headlines reporting on its occasional violences. While, quote, rent parties every night were the special passion of the community, as historian David Levering Lewis notes, quote, their very existence was avoided or barely acknowledged by most Harlem writers, and he frames a schism in terms of class difference. But the rent party's inherent ephemerality in crowded, dark settings also made its documentation difficult. The meager empirical traces left behind by the rent party, however, have not stopped critics from producing strong assessments of its value. One of the rent party's starkest assessments, dance scholar Katrina Hazard-Gordon, in her 1992 book, Jukin, The Rise of Social Dance Formations in African American Culture, argues rent parties were, quote, essentially an individual response to a large-scale problem that, quote, could not galvanize the community into a political unit. She continues, quote, had a political organization or strong tenants movement addressed housing needs, the rent party might not have developed such support. For Hazard-Gordon, the rent party indexes a political vacuum, marking the absence of black organization rather than its expression. But more recent work by James Wilson, Martin Summers, Stephen Robertson, Fred Moten, and Shane Vogel have focused on the sexual and sensuous forms the rent party sustained and encouraged. Vogel and Moten, I think, most explicitly challenge Hazard-Gordon's insistence on the rent party's apoliticism by claiming rent parties as sites for thinking the very terrain of the political itself. Vogel considers the Renaissance at large, and the rent party in particular, as manifestations of, quote, a different kind of politics, a sensate politics that figured prominently in the Harlem Renaissance cultures of sexual dissidence. Building from Vogel's investment in a sensate politics, I consider how this term might be deployed not only in relationship to the queering of domestic space, but the ideological space of private property more broadly, especially given homeownership's centrality to state-sponsored conceptions of citizenship at the time. So I'm really interested in thinking about the different theories of ownership that are emerging kind of concurrently from the Hoover administration, from real estate discourse, and from rent parties. There's little doubt that the tenants living in the crowded and crumbling conditions braved by many Harlem tenants would have leaped at the opportunity to buy or rent elsewhere. But in the course of fulfilling the base economic need of retaining shelter, rent parties made space for hosts and attendees to treat private property as merely a necessity, rather than as a calling, a civic duty, or a universal yearning, as was being promoted by the private housing industry in the state. And this is the moment in the early 20th century when the state is really, and the private market are really trying to invest home ownership with an ideological freight, right? Making it a civic, a moral, and a patriotic calling. I'm interested in the rent party is invested in housing, but not in those kind of moralistic or state terms. Whereas the state envisioned mass homeownership as a practice that could protect the bodies of its citizens from the sexual, sensory, and sanitary dangers of living too closely and without permanent financial investment, the rent party was an economic necessity that also suggested the vital sociality to be found in modes of dwelling beyond ownership. The jazz musicians who merged out of the rent party and historians who have studied them have left us important accounts of the rent party. And jazz historians have been really interesting on the rent party and thinking about the way the rent party participants didn't want to hear the blues, that they always wanted to hear jazz. But these narratives often overlook the role women played in the life of the rent party as hosts, entertainers, and attendees, which is kind of startling for me thinking about the 20s and the 30s and the power of the blues woman in this period, and the way that the kind of blues woman is either is written out of the narratives of the kind of jazz-centric rent party scene. Parties were most often held on Thursday and Saturday nights, the nights that Black domestics most regularly had off. Rent party invitation cards largely list women as hosts, and these are some of Langston Hughes's cards that he famously collected and wrote about in the Big C and at the Beinecke, and I think over half of them list women primarily as hosts. Women were also key to inventing and refining social dances popularized at rent parties, including the Black Bottom, the Bump, the Mess Around, and the Fishtail, co-opted by Broadway and the cabaret scene. The ephemerality of the rent parties archive mirrors the scantiness of the archive of the working class Black women whom these parties both catered to and helped to support. But the traces of these women within the rent parties archive suggest their embodied refutation of the home ownership ideology crafted and circulated by both the housing industry and the state. Saidiya Hartman has exhaustively described the limited economic opportunities and exacting legal and social regimes of discipline and punishment Black working women most associated with the rent party faced, while also attending to these women's experiments and daring to pursue their desires despite these conditions. Echoing Vogel's focus on, quote, the radical experimentations with sexual subjectivity and dissident form undertaken by Black and queer Harlemites, Hartman reclaims the innovative radicalism of young Black women whose, quote, transformations of sexuality, intimacy, affiliation, and kinship taking place in the Black quarter of northern cities might be labeled the revolution before Gatsby, end quote. Despite being largely written out of the histories of both the rent party and residential property, the wayward girls around whom the rent party scene revolved had firsthand knowledge of the racialized contours of both of these spheres. Employed by the white families, largely targeted by realtors for home ownership, while being themselves subject to the exploitative rental economy absorbing their hard-earned wages, these women were perhaps best equipped to assess the limitations of the racialized rhetoric of ownership while seeking other ways of claiming space. I'm going to bear down for the brief time that I have left on a particular example by Black journalist Ira D. Reid, his 1927 account, Mrs. Bailey Pays the Rent, which focuses on a kind of composite of a rent party hostess. Reid's title derives from the piece's lyrical epigraph, the jazz standard Bill Bailey, Won't You Please Come Home, in which the fictional Mrs. Bailey of song implores, quote, I'll do the cooking, I'll pay the rent, if her husband would only return. Although Reid was employed by the National Urban League, he eschewed empirical evidence such as interviews, economic data, or even realist description in his account, causing his piece to read more like a lyrical sketch than a sociological dissection. Reid focuses his account on a party given by a composite of female hosts that he names Mrs. Bailey after the article's lyrical epigraph. But whereas the Mrs. Bailey of song offers to pay the rent as a way of enticing her husband to come home, Reid leaves the motivations of her textual namesake beyond paying the rent unmarked. The home of the eponymous Mrs. Bailey of song is defined by traditional virtues such as marriage and cooking, while our host seems uninterested in this vision of home. This other Mrs. Bailey is too busy choreographing the complex movement of bodies temporarily occupying her space. She doesn't yearn for the attributes that realtor discourse in this period persistently yoked to home ownership, marriage, reproductive futurity, civic belonging, a strictly defined sense of moral virtue. Maybe she wants these things, maybe she doesn't, maybe she is too busy or too overworked to entertain these desires. All we know is that Mrs. Bailey wants to pay her rent this month and that throwing a good party is integral to that mission. Early on, we are briefly introduced to the party's saxophonist, whom Reid explains had, quote, recently quit the stage to play for the parties because he wanted to stay in New York. For this saxophonist, it is New York, rather than privately owned or occupied domestic space, that accrues the status of home. The rent party, moreover, is what allows him to inhabit his version of the homestead. From the start of Reid's piece, as he starts setting the scene in this way, a different teleology of home starts to emerge that frames the rent party as a financial necessity for enduring Harlem's harsh conditions, as well as part of what makes Harlem worth enduring at all. Ownership is not the catalyst of belonging here. Rather, the apartment merely frames the vibrancy it briefly collects for the night. Whereas realtors promoted ownership as the most significant event in a person's life, instigating an end of history of sorts for owners depicted as living in perpetual comfort and security forever after, Reid presents the rent party as a perpetual mixture of subjects and events that seem to add up to everything and nothing simultaneously. A nameless girl deals poker in a back room while the music in the front starts. A girl remarks that, quote, this party's getting right, before Mrs. Bailey proceeds to announce that evening's menu of pig feet and chili, inciting a fevered rush to the kitchen. The muscle that the hostess has paid to keep the peace intervenes on the dance floor when a fight breaks out between two men over a woman. The musicians exhort to 15 or 20 dancing couples while, quote, bedlam reigned. The party encourages temporary forms of sociality that reach great crescendos before dissipating just as quickly. Reed's narration has a blasé quality, kind of notes thing after thing after thing, capturing the everydayness of the rent party, undermining the public's fascination with Harlem and rent parties alike as sites of primitivist fantasy and moral deviance. By narrating the rent party as a genre with certain conventions, including violence, he disturbs its status as pure chaos. The kind of social and sensorial disorientation one seeks at the rent party, Reed suggests, is carefully cultivated and controlled by the Mrs. Baileys who make it possible. The party winds down as Mrs. Bailey calmly surveyed a disarranged party and counted her proceeds. While the story details all the rent party's notable customs, Reed refuses to offer a verdict regarding the rent party's value as he surveys alongside Mrs. Bailey its lingering residues and profits. Unlike in ownership ideology, there's no moral story to tell here about this financial and social form keeping Mrs. Bailey sheltered one more month. Juxtapose Mrs. Bailey's cool intake of her rented space and her profits to the effervescent feelings realtors ascribe to women living in an owned home. And this is just some of these kind of realtor pamphlets, journals, explicitly ideological props convincing people to own. Realtors, primarily targeting families as potential homeowners, became increasingly shrewd in appealing to women. Though much realtor discourse tethered ownership to visions of white masculinity, the industry also recognized the power of promoting ownership to the white women who generally managed the household. One woman-authored realtor article from 1924 made the case for ownership to women by exhorting that, quote, next to possessing a new husband or a new baby, owning a house is the most wonderful and thrilling thing in the world. And then the other quote, you trip up and down the stairs with your heart singing, mine, mine, mine. Recognizing that consumer goods pose the greatest competition for a woman's dollar, realtors emphasize the joy of investing in one's home, packaged as the most satisfying purchase a woman could help to make. But just as Mrs. Bailey does not pine for a lost husband, she also does not long for furs, trips, or homes. Consumption in the article takes place in relation to appetites rather than things. Reed depicts Mrs. Bailey's party providing opportunity for individual financial gain alongside the collective pursuit of bedlam. Reed avoids adjudicating the rent party's byproducts as either virtues or vices. He instead floats along the surface of its various vignettes, privileging the limbing of its atmosphere over describing its content, ascribing its content and value. Refusing to collapse domestic space into interior subjectivity, as is kind of the legacy of the novel form in general, Reed adopts a kinetic narrative form, sketching its movements, depicting the space that is domestic yet public, contained yet overflowing, circumscribed but porous. And yet, as Reed notes, there may be tragedies. He reprints an article, you can see a little bit here, he reprints an article from the New York Age reporting on an incident at a party where, quote, one jealous woman cut the throat of another because the two were rivals for the affections of a third woman. The article decries the rent party as being, quote, dangerous to the health of all concerned. But Reed provides no further commentary on this piece of reporting beyond introducing it as tragedy. He just kind of like leaves it there. He does not deny the rent party's occasional violence, but neither does he dwell on it, nor the queer desire that fueled its unfolding in this case. Just like the outburst at Mrs. Bailey's party, the violence emerges from someone's efforts to possess the object of their affection when challenged by a rival. No matter the source of the desire, the attempt to seek possession within the rent party produces its greatest tragedy. Okay, so I'm getting close to the end here. Reed concludes with one last anecdote, and I'll end with this, that returns us to the ambivalent position he seems to most relish. He describes a 9-year-old boy gazing up from the street to his apartment in the middle of the night. When the music dies down for a moment, the boy seizes the opportunity to shout up to his mother that he's tired and wants to come home. A man sticks his head out of the window to relay the following message that concludes the article. Quote, your ma says to go to the midnight show and she'll come after you. Here's 4 bits. She says the party's just got going good. As with the New York Age excerpt, he presents this occurrence without commentary, just kind of leaves it there. Whereas the song opening Reed's piece is about a husband and a wife, he leaves us to wonder about this different dyad, the fate of mother and son. Given his expulsion from one rented space to take up refuge in another, it's hard to know if the boy's exile is one of salvation or neglect, whether the collectivity he might find at the midnight show is markedly better or worse than what might be found at the party. There's no third option granting him his wish of protected rest. The boy must leave home to have a home to return to. This ending foregrounds several competing futurities, with the boy's immediate future and perhaps his longer-term prospects placed next to the potential futurity of a party that, quote, just got going good. Reed does not express nostalgia for a lost Southern mutualism, as a lot of kind of rent party pieces at the time did, nor does he offer up ownership as the solution to the Black housing crisis in the North, as others were also doing in the time of the Black and white middle classes. Reed merely frames the divergent desires of this young boy who wants to stop and his mother who needs to keep going. The party cannot reconcile their aims, only set them in relation to one another. Whereas reformers of the day would have us hear the boys' cries as a moral shame and kind of zoom in on the boys' cries as a kind of takeaway from this, Reed, along with later Vogel and Hartman, urge us to attend to his mother's utterances just as closely. What might the party that is just getting good make possible for her and for the many? What dream of dwelling and living does she glimpse therein? So, thanks.
So next we'll have Mindy Fullilove, who is a professor of urban policy and health at the New School. Prior to joining the New School in 2016, she worked for 26 years as a research psychiatrist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and was a professor of clinical psychiatry and public health here at Columbia University. She has conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics of poor communities with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and decline in health. She's published numerous articles, book chapters, and monographs, including The House of Joshua, Meditations on Family and Place, Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America. This is where I first became acquainted with her work. And What to Do About It, that's part of the title, and Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities. A third edition of Homeboy Came to Orange, A Story of People's Power, which she helped her father, Ernest Thompson Wright, was released in May 2018 by New Village Press. So, Mindy.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I want to talk about a project that I'm involved with, which is called 400 Years of Inequality, and it's a call for a people's observance of this anniversary of Jamestown, which I know everybody's probably already planning your festivities. Our approach to this comes out of an earlier project called NYC Recovers. At the time of the attack on the World Trade Center, our research team was literally doing field work for Root Shock. And Root Shock was a study of what American urban renewal in the 50s and 60s had done to Black communities. It turns out that although African Americans were 2/3 of the people displaced by America's huge urban renewal project at that time, there's really literally nobody who went out and asked the African Americans what it was like. So our study was a retrospective, talking to people who had been displaced about what that had been like. And at the heart of it was this story of catastrophe tearing apart a neighborhood and what people lost when that happens. So we felt when we watched the World Trade Center collapse that we were watching the tearing apart of a neighborhood, of a central business district, which had gathered tens of thousands of people every day, which was a heart of the transportation center, which was a symbol of New York City in the larger metropolitan area. There were the Twin Towers were on every mural in every pizza parlor in the greater New York region. So when that collapsed, it had this effect of root shock for the region. But the official response was very much focused on what they came to call heroes and victims. And so everybody else was left out and was supposed to go back to seeing Broadway shows and shopping. Very quickly, by January 1st, they announced that we had closure on the tragedy and everything was fine. Our project therefore called for organizations of all kinds to take responsibility for their constituents and to help them recover by incorporating whatever they thought their constituents needed, however they were feeling this loss of the World Trade Center, into their ongoing activities. One of the things we learned in the course of that work was about what we came to call the ritual calendar, that our lives are held together by these collective things. So New Year's Day, and then Valentine's Day, and then St. Patrick's Day, and then Easter, Passover. So this whole calendar that's set up every year, where each of these events is different and gathers us in different ways. So on Thanksgiving, we gather with our families. On Halloween, we go out in the street and watch how people dress up in strange ways. So it gathers us very differently, but the set helps us gives a form to the year. And each of those events is in relationship to all the versions of that event that you have ever seen. On Christmas, you remember all the Christmases of your life. And you talk about them. So, oh, remember what we did last Christmas? Or remember when I was 5 and I wanted such and such and you didn't give it to me? My brother, for example, really wanted the Getty gasoline truck, which he just, got like 2 years ago. We've been talking about that thing for a long time. So what we learned was that the anniversary of 9/11 would become a part of the ritual calendar in New York City. But we also knew that as carried out by the government, it would become part of the rhetoric of heroes and victims and of warmongering. And that wasn't at all how the people of New York City felt. And so part of the issue was, how would the people like to observe the anniversary? And that's what we worked with our partners, and created quite a different day. So one of the groups that we worked with was a group that was making a labyrinth, working with school children in the South Bronx in a vacant lot to make a labyrinth. And so one of the morning for us opened with being in the South Bronx and walking the labyrinth with people in the neighborhood. Very quiet, very solemn occasion. Then we went to Union Square, where everybody was, and there were all kinds of things going on. And what was important about the people's observance was how nourishing it was. There wasn't any warmongering. There wasn't any hate. It was what was coming from people's hearts. So when we started thinking in 2016 about 2019, what we really wanted to create was a people's observance. My own approach to it was very much formed by my father, Ernest Thompson, and Mabel mentioned that I helped him write his book, A Homeboy Came to Orange, A Story of People's Power. My father was one of the labor leaders who built the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was a founder of the National Negro Labor Council, and then worked to build black political power in our town of Orange, New Jersey. And this is a mural which is in the headquarters of his union, United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, in Local 506. Extraordinarily gorgeous mural about women in the labor movement. There are 3 men in the mural, one of whom is my father. And what he says is the history of our country shows that the fight of women is closely bound to the fight of the Negro people. And part of his work in the union was to be head of a Fair Employment Practices Committee, and it built solidarity between the workers of color and the women workers who those groups experienced discrimination in pay, discrimination in promotion. And the effort of the union was a commitment to help people who were being left behind to have equity in the workplace. So taking that cue from him, I worked with students at the New School to make a timeline as one of the ways to begin to visualize this 400 years. And you can find this timeline on our website, 400yearsofinequality.org. And to do this, we followed 4 lines of people's experience. And our textbook was Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. So we followed stories of women, of Native people, of working people, and of African Americans to see how these were bound together. There's a second set that's in 2 parts. The whole timeline is like, it's long. But quite a remarkable thing to have, because people stopped to study it, stopped to take in. The 400 years looked at in this way as a people's history, as our stories being interwoven in important ways, is not something we've particularly seen before. And so when people, you lay it out on a table or you lay it out on a floor and people can study it, it has a very powerful effect. So out of that, we then work together in our committee to make a call, and the call is also on our website. We're currently in the process of translating it into dozens of languages. And so in the short form is we call on everyone to prepare observances for the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. We do this to denounce structures of inequality. We do this to foreground our fundamental and unconditional equality. We remember, and in doing so, we refuse to participate in and reproduce structures of dehumanization, exploitation, oppression, and inequity. We have foregrounded inequality and called our project 400 Years of Inequality because we became convinced that the creation of an ideology that not all people were fully human is the most terrible and most lasting legacy of slavery. And if you think of this as kind of the scarlet letter that gets produced by slavery, it's an object that can be applied to anyone for any reason, that we can recreate what makes inequality. Just as we have shifted what whiteness means, we can shift what blackness means, we can shift what inequality means. So it can fit any need of the structure, basically to divide and conquer. And so thinking about inequality as a thing, as an operator in the system of American capitalism, of international capitalism, is where we wanted to focus attention, which we think calls everyone to observance, because almost everyone is suffering from this thing, this inequality in one form or another, what we call the ecology of inequality. So people are the many thousands of people that we've talked to about this and that have heard our call to observance are in their own ways thinking what to do. We ourselves had a party in March. We've had an annual symposium as part of our organizing process, and this was our 3rd annual organizing symposium. But this year it was a party. We wanted to do the things we wanted to do for our observance. And so these are some photos from our marvelous day, and which started off with a quite remarkable film about the Bracero program, which brought Mexicans into the United States as farm workers in the 50s and 60s. Horrific program, incredibly deeply moving film. We learned about translating documents into Creole so that Haitian people who primarily speak Creole could have more contact with the documents of their own revolution, which only exist in English and French. It was also very eye-opening. We worked on what were the stories that each of us thought we would like to tell in this anniversary year. And we saw a most beautiful dance from a dance project called the Cotton Series. And it was just mind-boggling and eye-opening. So it was a really lovely day. That was what we thought an observance of 400 years of inequality, the stories we wanted to think about and be in relationship to. Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health is one of a number of schools of public health that is organizing observances, and you can find this with a long article on their website. They are planning to have a symposium on October 14th, Indigenous Peoples Day, but also to launch a year of conversation. Union Theological Seminary, which is just up the street from here, is going to put up this banner, and we're working on organizing with them what we call a solemn occasion for Sunday the 13th, which, if all works well, we will hold at Riverside Church. And what's so important about talking with them is that the voices of the faith leaders, we think, are tremendously important, because this is clearly a story of mourning, it's a story of rage, it's a story of injury, and to some extent, when you look at the whole story of it, it's very painful. Alice Walker, in her foreword to Barracoon, talks about the wound and the medicine, that when you read Barracoon, you see the wound of this experience of being dragged from homeland and dropped here into slavery. But that the medicine in the book are the moments of transcendence. So Mr. Lewis is talking to her, and then he gets tired of talking, and he says, "You have to go now. I have to work in the garden." And Alice Walker is a gardener, and so for her, she's talking about just segueing from this deep conversation about this injury to the garden is important. And that's why we think faith leaders are so important to this experience. Where I live in Essex County, and I do a lot of work in my hometown of Orange, New Jersey, we have an annual concert called Remembering Rosa, which is a school and church choirs. And so this year, we hope to have an exceptionally large concert on December 1st, which is the day that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, and invite not only the faith leaders of Orange, but faith leaders from surrounding towns to stand together and to provide that medicine as we look at the wound. And then there's a project in Washington Heights, closely connected to Mailman School of Public Health, called City Life is Moving Bodies, and they do an annual Hike the Heights, where they hike a trail that runs between Central Park and the Cloisters. So there are 10 starting points in Harlem and Washington Heights, and people hike to a central point where there's a big party. And so this year's 15th annual Hike the Heights, they have designated as one of a series of events. Our team has tried to make lots of materials, and we're making lots more, so that if people are thinking about an event, they can refer to simple things. One of the things that we learned from NYC Recovers is that a lot of people will, on October 12th, they'll say, "Hey, I want to do that." And obviously, they won't have had the year of planning that Boston University School of Public Health has had. They'll have a day or something like that. And so we try to provide materials so that anybody coming up to this at any time this year, during the whole year of 2019, could pick up a piece of paper and think, okay, I'm going to sit down with my family and we're going to watch Blackish and talk about it, so that everybody can join. And then one of the important through lines has been Howard Zinn's People's History, but we were very fortunate that the group Voices of a People's History joined our project early on and said, you got to pay attention. This is really the book to use, because you can open this book, Voices of a People's History, on any page and read what people have to say. And it's an extraordinary and moving thing. So my class, 400 Years of Inequality, this year has created a set of excerpts and is doing a reading, actually this Tuesday. If you have free and you're downtown, come join us. It's going to be great. Tuesday, 4 to 6. And I just wanted to close with a short film of my colleagues and I in Orange doing a reading as part of our own beginning to reflect on how we would observe the anniversary. And so may I ask you to show the video now? I got a thumbs up. That was the key word.
Yeah, you say that you have offers to buy me, that you shall sell me if I do not send you $1,000. And in the same breath and almost in the same sentence you say, you know we raised you as you did our own children. Women, did you raise your own children for the market?
Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syruply sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
The sun was dazzling. That was the moment. There was no sound. I felt something strong.
It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. At that moment, I thought I would be the only one who would die. I said to myself, goodbye, Mom.
There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America?
I'm sure that all of you will be hosting observances of some kind. And we would love to post it on our website. We'll have a map. We do have a map. So everybody's events can go up on the map. We have a listing. And what people are planning is extraordinary. It's the whole diaspora. It's all the colors of the rainbow. You'll be hearing from Carnegie Hall, Brooklyn Historical Society, Tulane School of Public Health, all over the nation. It'll be blooming. October 12th to 18th is a point of convergence, but I think all through the rest of the year. And so let us know what you're doing so that we can share your thoughts and ideas and observances with the nation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mindy. So next we will have a presentation from Mpho Matsipa, who received her PhD in architecture from UC Berkeley. She is an adjunct assistant professor of architecture and urbanism at Columbia GSAPP and faculty in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Witswatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. She's a researcher advisor and a co-investigator on an Andrew Mellon research grant on urban mobilities. She's written critical essays on art and architecture and curated several exhibitions and discursive platforms, including the South African Pavilion at the 11th International Architecture Exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2008. African Mobilities at the Architecture Museum Pinakotheka Modern in Munich, which was in 2018, and for Studio X Johannesburg between 2014 and 2016. So Mpho.
Thank you very much, Mabel, and also thank you to IRAAS for this very generous invitation. I feel incredibly enriched, and I feel that the 16-hour flight from Johannesburg to New York was very much worthwhile, in addition to reminding me about the fact that we enjoy differential mobilities even as Black people. So today what I wanted to do is my initial ambition was to explore a short film titled Dreamscapes that was produced by a Brooklyn-based artist, Olele Kanjefus, and a Lagosian writer called Walela Wal that I commissioned for the African Mobilities exhibition as part of the Mpho City Commission. But what I would like to do instead is to situate this conversation in relation to my concerns around African spatial imaginaries as an epistemological category that can advance the project of knowledge production in architecture and urbanism. For me, this involves a deterritorializing approach to knowledge production that seeks to escape the spell of the status quo through sublime landscapes, their incommensurability, and the willingness of its subjects to be free. As such, landscapes, as argued by Catherine McKittrick, are neither complete nor fully intelligible. Instead, they are permeable and material indications of uncertainty of place. McKittrick argues that Black geographies and Blackness itself are isomorphic, in the sense that Blackness has the possibility to become a site of radical possibility, supernatural travels, and difficult epistemological returns to the past and the present. Furthermore, being materially located in place holds in it possibilities that do not neatly replicate or privilege traditional spatial patterns of transparency. Achille Mbembe, too, draws our attention to the problem of a unitary logics or universal grammars found in social theory that tends to privilege Western modernity as the only modern consciousness that in turn make it difficult to understand non-Western objects and landscapes within the dominant paradigms of the West. In contrast, McKittrick suggests a non-deterministic schema, a process that is hinged on uncertainty, non-linearity as a starting point for mapping Black geographies. This is a geography that is genealogically wrapped up in the historical and spatial unrepresentability of Black femininity and the ways in which Black women necessarily contribute to a representation of human geography. For me, this call for a representation of human geography through Blackness also raises the question of African urban futures as an important site of exploration. I'm interested in how artists spatialize Blackness in ways that do not repeat two dominant tropes attached to African urban environments, namely that African societies are simple, ahistoric, and trapped in panoptic time, and secondly, the idea of the slum as simply a vector of social death, a time-space that tracks the territorialization of Black life as a locus of death and anti-Black violence alone. Instead, I'm interested in how Blackness functions as a site of radical imagination and new modes of representation, and to that end, this paper is organized around 3 moments. Oh, where's mine? But before I get to that, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about the African Mobilities exhibition, just to give you a sense of the scale. And also to think about a few thoughts about curating design, pedagogy, and intellectual mobilities in Africa. Secondly, I want to present a meditation on the imaginative possibilities for mapping as an unfolding layered process of exploration, of alienation and disalienation. And finally, a discussion of Mad Horse City and Dreamscapes as a psychogeographic exploration of urban segmentation in Lagos that centers on marginalized urban subjects in the city of the future. So African Mobilities was, and the full title of the show was African Mobilities, this is not a refugee camp exhibition, was a 2-year-long collaboration between the University of the Witswatersrand in South Africa and the Architecture Museum at TU München in Germany that was funded by the German federal government. The show opened in April 2018 within this museum that has one of the largest collections of architectural exhibits in Germany, and it's housed inside the Pinakothek de Moderne, a 22,000 square meter building, alongside special collections divided into art, architecture, design, and works on paper. The exhibition was organized around 3 themes: cartographies, speculative futures, and prototypes. And the design brief for the space, which I developed with Wolf Architects, a Cape Town-based design practice, called for a space of delay and an invitation to engage with an archive how African-oriented thinkers approach future urban imaginaries and architecture and urban prototypes that were instigated by World in Motion. So just to give you a sense of the content of the show, it was vast. There were 14 different submissions from across the African continent and the diaspora. So rather than focus on moving bodies alone, I was equally concerned with intellectual mobilities and the circulation of ideas across linguistic, territorial, and disciplinary divides. To that end, that exhibition was conceptualized as a physical space that had a total of 44,000 visitors from April to August, a series of decentralized events, a digital publication, a mobile pedagogical platform, and a transcontinental network that comprised of architects and other creative practitioners who are both established and emergent, theorists and scholars from 14 different locations that included Johannesburg, Harare, Luanda, Kampala, Addis Ababa, Abidjan, Lagos, Dakar, New York, Nairobi, Lubumbashi, Praia, and Munich. It also included 9 institutions, including Columbia University's Global Africa Lab, and 8 workshops, discursive platforms across Africa and the diaspora. As the curator, I was also very invested in exploring collectively alternative imaginaries of the future and the role of architectural research and design as possible sites of invention. So there were many contributors to the theoretical frameworks of this exhibition, and one of them was art historian Mpho, who suggests the idea of knowledge-making itself as a form of mobility. For example, his representation of a René Calais lithograph provides detail, despite itself, of an intersectional mobility inhabiting several identities. Okoye is concerned with the accuracies and inaccuracies of maps, which reveal how rivers serve as sites of mobilities and culture formation in pre-colonial movements across the continent, such as the river bend along the river Niger from Timbuktu to Djenné. Okoye converts the idea of this liquid bend into a trope for reading the unusual nature of urbanism in this terrain in order to dissolve the strict boundaries between the rather rigid ideas urbanists and spatial practitioners have about cityness as permanence and nomadism. Similarly, the curatorial strategy was informed by a number of mobile platforms like Studio X Johannesburg and Ashiko, whereas Studio X, conceptualized by Mark Wigley and also in collaboration with Global Africa Lab, constituted a decentralized global network of experimental research studios whose command center was Columbia University's GSAP. BC Silver's itinerant and transnational art school, Ashiko, asserted Africa as one center amongst other centers in a multipolar universe of knowledge production and artistic and curatorial practice. Here I want to draw on BC Silver's towering legacy in terms of addressing the differential mobilities afforded to African design students and creative practitioners relative to their peers in Ivy League institutions and their privileged mobilities through traveling studios abroad. Furthermore, the African mobilities model, like Ashiko, sought a radical alternative to the state educational models found in many academic institutions on the African continent that had inherited a British colonial educational system. This model explicitly aims to address a fault line in design education and practice in Africa by introducing research-based practice and critical theory to architecture and planning practices that was transnational and transdisciplinary. The mobilities exchanges aim to position themselves within an expanded and networked field. The decentralized structure allowed for heightened degrees of specificity from each location and from African perspectives. Location and locality formed important counterpoints to theory-driven generalizations in conversation with a set of global concerns. These exchanges also served as future contact zones and networks amongst collaborators from across the continent and its diasporas. South African filmmaker Nduka Mtambo argues that artistic research may stimulate the development of techniques of reading and writing that are characterized by aesthetic openings and encounters between diverse fields of knowledge and epistemes. This notion of what he calls an agglutinative mode of inquiry provides a way of organizing research information that is agrammatical and that has the capacity to oscillate rapidly between different modalities. This formal fluidity frames the African mobilities approach to research questions regarding art, design, and mobility in conditions of instability and flux. The exchanges as spaces were also conceived as spaces of articulation that provided an opening to create new spatial vocabularies collectively that meant not only speaking to questions of literary whiteness in urban studies and architectural history, but also attending to Black spatial imagination and new modes of representation. So this is one of the exchanges that we had in Harare that was a collaboration with Njelele Art Station, which is an independent art space in Zimbabwe about 2 years ago. So I want to move to the two submissions for the exhibition that are part of the content by talking briefly about cartographies. And this is a project titled The Territory in Between by a young architect called Aisha Balde. On a site 22.5 kilometers off the coast of Cape Verde, Ghanaian architect Aisha Balde explored the interplay between physical and imagined spaces in ways that allow us to rethink our understanding of state, boundary, and space. Through drawings, Aisha produced fluid notions of territory, exploring the in-between spaces that contradict what she considers to be two conventional underpinnings of site and state. According to Balde, while state often refers to an organized political community under one government, it also denotes one's condition at any given time. The project thus considers the tensions between the formation, contestation, and contradictions of territories and the maintenance of edges and borders. Through this imaginative mapping exercise, Aisha was able to conceptualize an imagined site as a pit stop, a way station for migrants on their journey home to an unknown destination. Balde's drawings appropriate a geographical and cartographical system made up of a hypothetical location that produces an indeterminate terrain and locates an elusive liquid geography. Rather than colonizing this territory through surveys and inventory, Balde marks an otherwise vast and seemingly empty space with a series of notations, inscriptions, and numbers that uncover hidden spatial relationships through a range of cartographic procedures of selection, schematization, and synthesis, which make the map, the territory, and the site already a project in the making. The question of African futures is important to me and others precisely because Africa has discursively been understood as those who have no future. More specifically, the study of African architecture and cities has been informed by a number of imaginaries, such as developmentalism and humanitarianism, that limit the scope of what might constitute an imaginable future or futures. In contrast to this discourse, Olalekan Jafis's Shanti megastructure projects alternative heterotopic futures for Lagos in the face of large-scale real estate development, displacement, infrastructure and environmental precarity of the lagoon, which he explored in an American Institute of Architecture design competition for a skyscraper. As argued by Charles Davis II, Jafis's visual assemblages overlay various technological ecologies associated with urban modernity. Infrastructures such as power cables and highway overpasses alongside the technologies of fishing rafts and suspended wooden homes to produce a future imaginary of Lagos that forces a more direct confrontation between two seemingly disparate milieux. In fact, the Shanti, as he calls it, becomes the ordering principle through which technology is articulated and subverts conventional tropes that link technological advancement with Western modernity. The Shanti megastructure constitutes an inversion of the visual grammars of a mythical Western urban modernity in order to produce new symbolic orders imbued with both sensorial and political experiences that heighten the visibility of one of the most marginalized urban populations in Lagos. Whereas Charles Davis II suggests that Jafis synthesizes the megastructural scale and technological themes of post-war architectural utopianism with the nuanced interpretations of the everyday, I want to make a slightly different argument, which is that the hypervisibility of the slum not only stakes out black spaces in the future, but also makes distinctive statements about modernization and oppression as co-evil. By projecting contemporary urban spatial patterns into the future and forcing a direct confrontation and the visibility of people who many city governments would like to see disappear. Here, the figure of the slum as a vortex of social death is turned on its head to reveal a new set of questions which I link to McKittrick's exploration of black geographies. How am I doing for time?
You're fine.
Okay. In her discussion of dispossession, McKittrick states that the legacy of dispossession underwrites how we know space and place, and I quote, "The landless black subject is anchored in a new world grid that is economically, racially, and sexually normative, or seemingly non-black. This grid suppresses the possibility of black geographies by invalidating the subject's cartographic needs, expressions, and knowledges," unquote. So conventional notions of ownership are underpinned by racial codes that mark the black body as ungeographic, which is characterized by dispossession and social segregation. McKittrick also argues that traditional geographies have close ties between the body and the landscape that might translate black geographies as homogeneous sites of dispossession. The megastructure project, to a certain degree, disrupts these stereotypes, which have become the primary medium of exchange that is so tightly bound to the idea of dispossessed black bodies as naturally in place. So McKittrick posits black geographies as the terrain of political struggle itself, or where the imperative of a perspective of struggle takes place. Here, the location of black history, selfhood, imagination, and resistance are not only attached to the production of space through the marginality, but also through the ways in which they bring into focus responses to domination. Black geographies are located within and outside the boundaries of traditional space through black social particularities and knowledges. They locate and speak back to geographies of modernity, transatlantic slavery, and colonialism, and the complexities of these geographies is found in the ways that they reveal new ideas. So Jafis's rhizomorphic landscape demonstrates both the limitations and the possibilities of traditional architectural vocabularies through the ways in which black subjectivity is produced by and producing spatial knowledge. In a final iteration of the megastructure project, Jafis and Lagosian writer Wale Lawal met in real time for the first time in Lagos during Lagos Exchange to develop the interiority of the megastructure project for African Mobilities. What emerged was Mad Horse City, a wildly imaginative multimedia project that consisted of a graphic novella, animated films, and 4 360 VR sets. A futurist project like Mad Horse City works on the exposure and reframing of futurisms that act to forecast and fix African dystopia. They created instead an anticipatory narrative and designs that reassemble the predatory futures forecast over the next 100 years as not only a future that Kojo Shun describes as a future of unmitigated despair, but also characterized by the promise of intervention in the dimension of the anticipatory and the future conditional in the figure of Akura Kuda. So the central character in the graphic novella is a young girl who loses her father, who's basically an illegal fisherman in this future Lagos that has become a cultural landscape, particularly for the urban poor. On the other hand, their short film Dreamscapes explores disparities in digital assets within Lagos of the future that determines not only how one lives, but also how one dreams and ultimately dies. The central character is a dislocated figure, a cipher for secret powers that are a key to a liberated future that allows the narrative to reach a point of speculative acceleration. In Dreamscapes, they map out the possibilities available for subjects whose everyday lives in this future Lagos appear to be completely saturated with the logics of a carceral, predatory, neoliberal capitalist development and futurist technologies that colonize their conscious and unconscious lives. One of the recurring themes of these moments is the figure of the outsider. This outsider position is not merely the function of exclusion, but also a central trope in understanding those whose agency locates them outside the framework of power. The outsider becomes a future of dynamism and instability, and the possibility of freedom and maybe even revolution. So, through a play of various cartographic devices like framing, scale, orientation, assembly, isolation, projection, both the space in between and Mad Horse City think about sight as a mediated state of being that is constituted through an engagement with the simultaneous multiplicities of Mbembe and temporalities. Balde's mappings, like Mad Horse City's VR sets, stage suggestive vehicles for various possibilities. They map alternative itineraries, subverting dominant visual spatial readings of place, state, and bureaucratic power. Both sites are contingent, ephemeral, vague, characterized by the fugitive eventfulness of spatial experience that are foregrounded over the dominant disciplinary gaze of the state. As argued by James Corner, the superimposition of various independent layers of space and time produce a heterogeneous and thickened surface. The mappings and sets array an enabling topography, producing a stratified amalgam of relationships amongst disparate parts. The composite field is one of multiple parts and elements, a field of multiple orders through techniques of multiplicity, montage, and hybridization. The layered field remains open to numerous interpretations, uses, and transformations, which I hope might become a creative opening for rethinking African urbanism.
Thank you, Mpho. And we now will have Deborah Thomas, who is the R. Jean Brownleen Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. She is also the co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race, Transformation in the Cultural Production of Blackness. Her new book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. Thomas has directed and produced the documentary films Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May, and the experimental short film 4 Days in West Kingston. She's also the co-curator of a multimedia installation titled Bearing Witness, 4 Days in West Kingston, which opened at the Penn Museum in November 2017. She's also the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal of the American Anthropologist Association. Deborah.
Just want to join my voice to the various rounds of thanks that have been offered to Farah and Kelly and Sean and Sharon and everybody who helped put this together. I'm honored to be in such company and have really enjoyed the conversations over the couple days. We are walking with Annette, or rather, we're walking behind Annette. She has agreed to lead us through Tivoli Gardens so that our cinematographer can shoot street scenes. We're making a film that is designed to provide a platform for people to talk about what happened to them during the so-called Tivoli incursion during the week of May 24th, 2010, and to publicly name and memorialize loved ones they lost when the security forces penetrated Tivoli Gardens to capture and extradite Christopher Dudus Coke. We have left the community proper and are walking in the informal settlement area that sits on land owned by the National Works Agency, which despite the name change years ago, community members still call the PWD, Public Works Department. The first time we did a walkthrough of the community in 2012, community members living on the other side of the wall from the PWD dump told us they smelled what they thought were bodies burning during the state of emergency. Now we're passing what looks like an empty field with some patchy grass growing. And it tells us that the soldiers had dug up the land during the state of emergency looking for weapons. Did they find any, we asked? She said no. A little further down, the land is owned by the Jamaica Railway Corporation, and we pass what looks like the first row of blocks, foundations for concrete houses. Behind these are makeshift houses made from panels, doors that clearly had earlier incarnations, corrugated tin, and pallets, sometimes colorfully painted, pink, yellow, blue, and green. These dwellings have replaced others that were blasted down, bombed during the incursion. Anthropologist Don Robotham once dubbed Kingston a wounded city, the result of the growth of urban colonial ghettos in the late 19th century and their transformation into garrison communities during the mid-20th. Wounds leave scars, the material traces of violent encounters like pockmarked walls, burnt-out stairwells, or broken windows that now dot the artificial landscape of Tivoli Gardens. But wounds can also remain invisible, like police action now covered by patchy grass, or like colorful pallets serving as fences for new precarious dwellings, or like heartache. I'm interested in what these wounds tell us about the constellation of post-emancipation political developments in Jamaica. What insights do they give us regarding the more general geospatial contours of Kingston's socio-political and economic entanglements? How might we consider them as an archive, not merely of the material traces of the performance of sovereignty, but also of the immaterial and affective dimensions of its experience of what sovereignty feels like? What can they tell us about what it means to be human, politically, in the wake of the plantation? These questions have been haunting me over the past 12 years, during which I've been developing archives of the relationships between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. My specific obsessions have had to do with how these relationships have shaped the complex processes of subjectivity within a modernity whose foundational infrastructures were imperialism, colonization, and plantation-based slavery. I've been interested in what Sylvia Wynter identified as a constitutive tension between the dominant logic of the plantation, a logic that undergirds all modern sovereignty projects, and its internal threat, the often millennial spaces within which enslaved persons maintained a sense of themselves as human rather than as property. It is this tension that would ultimately shape the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty. In Jamaica, the political economy of modern citizenship was, by the mid-20th century, defined through participation in the trade union movement. This broad movement ultimately became politicized via the formation of oppositional political parties, the People's National Party in 1938 and the Jamaica Labour Party in 1941, each connected to a union. From the earliest moments, conflicts between unions were also partisan conflicts over territory, especially in downtown Kingston, and these conflicts were often violent. Power in this context was personalized, and allegiances to union leaders, and therefore to political parties, were generally understood to be transmitted through the family, the community, and the workplace. Clientelistic networks solidified divisions within the working class and secured the hegemony of colonial class relations and patterns of leadership. By the 1967 elections, patronage was explicitly wielded as a political weapon, in particular through the construction of housing schemes that were made available to people on the basis of party membership. The removal of squatters from Western Kingston and the subsequent construction of Tivoli Gardens solidified the links between housing, territory, and political party, and led to the development of what are called garrison communities. Contemporary garrisons, of which Tivoli Gardens is often considered the most perfect example, are thus territorially rooted, homogeneous voting communities where political support is exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits. As in the past, these exchanges have been institutionalized and even codified as part of general procedures for the distribution of paid work and social services among constituencies downtown, with the vote benefits nexus mediated through the relationship between an elected politician and a local don. This relationship became part of a more general ideological struggle during the 1970s, and it subsequently transformed as the elaboration of the transnational trades in cocaine and weapons supplanted a previously smaller-scale trafficking in ganja. These trades strengthened the role of the dons vis-à-vis the politicians, as dons' increasing involvement in both illicit and legitimate businesses has provided politicians with financial support, in addition to the military support offered during election periods. What has developed is a kind of permanent war in which Kingston figures centrally as spatially, racially, and a politically polarized place, and this is what has brought garrison dons to the attention of the US government. Indeed, the US was also fundamental to the reorganization of sovereignty in Jamaica after World War II, and intelligence gathering and labor mobilizing were the critical institutional spheres of this reorganization. Thinking these histories and entanglements together gives us some avenues for apprehending the multiplicity of sovereignties in which Jamaicans are imbricated and to which Jamaicans have responded in different ways at different times. In Tivoli Gardens, certainly there have been multiple sovereignties at play, and the different scales at which they've operated, sometimes in collaboration and sometimes not, give us windows into the affective socio-political fields in which people attempt to make life. We're in my friend Mikey's studio on Deanery Road, recording people as they narrate their experiences during the incursion. It is our hope that by filming people outside of Tivoli Gardens, we might reduce the visual noise that sometimes seems to clutter an audience's ability to hear. One of the musicians who is hanging out at the studio calls his nephew to say he needs to come and tell his story. Within an hour, Sean is there, and we put him in front of the camera. Sean talks about being pulled out of his house while he's holding his 1-year-old son. The police order him to put the boy down and get on his knees, but the baby is too young to stand on his own. Sean is led from building to building with other men. They're taken to clear a roadblock. Their hands are strapped behind their backs. They spend the night in a leaky school bathroom together, some of them groaning in pain, others weak without their necessary medication. They're put in the back of a truck and taken to another building where they're made to line up on their knees in 2 rows in the courtyard. Soldiers taunt them with machine guns. They're returned to the truck and are taken to the National Stadium, where they are processed and ultimately released. At the 2nd or 3rd or 4th building, Sean remembers a soldier picking on him in particular because at that time he was using a bleaching cream. I had a little skin tone being brown, he explained, and the soldier told him he didn't like how he looked, saying he should kill him for looking at him in that way. Sean's friends beside him told him, just easy, allow him, make him talk, don't look upon him. Where many have interpreted skin bleaching as a sign of racial self-hatred, we could as readily understand it as a form of performance and play, a visual technology designed to facilitate a process of representation. The derision related to bleaching is often most heatedly expressed by Black middle-class Jamaicans, Yet because Jamaica is a majority black society, the racial color dimension of politics is not ordinarily recognized as an important factor in the analyses of the structural configuration of the garrison. This is despite the centrality of race to cultural and political struggles since the 19th century, itself the result of a plantation-based modernity that defined humanity in racial terms. For those who cut their teeth on the black nationalisms of the late 1960s black power movements, however, Edward Seaga's conceptualization and implementation of the plans for the housing community of Tivoli Gardens would have represented an aborted process of racial consciousness. For these nationalists, Seaga, a Lebanese Jamaican who looks white, created with Tivoli Gardens a self-hating black population by transferring the reverence for British whiteness to Syrian whiteness, thus interrupting a process of black socio-political and spiritual liberation that was in process elsewhere in West Kingston at the time through the formation of Rastafari camps and other groups committed to forms of critical black consciousness. Representatives of the security forces, themselves members of an emergent black middle class, might also have seen this maneuver as an affront to their position and consciousness, and this could have fed into their approach to Tivoli Gardens during the state of emergency. Before the incursion, Sean was in the music business, selling CDs during dances and occasionally working as a selector for a sound system. The months following the incursion saw him in a self-imposed exile from Tivoli Gardens. During this period, beyond regular visits from his baby mother and his son, what kept him afloat materially and emotionally was the Japanese expatriate community in Kingston. They looked after him, he said, thus situating himself within a transnational network of young Japanese men and women who travel regularly to Jamaica to participate in the very popular cultural practices that are often derided locally. These youth move alongside downtown denizens, seeking out the blinding video light of the dance hall. This light not only constitutes one of many practices that Krista Thompson has called spectacular visibility, but also potentially reconfigures the surveillant or categorizing functions of the visual archive in relation to Black folk. We're watching a draft of the film with some of the community members whose narratives populate it. We want to make sure they feel comfortable with the direction we're moving in and with what they have said. It's the first time they're seeing the footage recorded by the US drone that was overhead during the operation. Some mix of anxiety and awe fills the room as they watch from a perspective that is at time as far as 2.5 miles above them what they experienced cowering under somebody's dining room table, taking turns crawling to the bathroom, unable to eat or sleep. "Boy, you caught something there," Annette says as she points to soldiers running alongside of a building. Our audience watches as police, small like ants, skitter next to bulldozers and tanks rolling down the street and clearing roadblocks. They see the snipers on the rooftops, the soldier bending down, picking up something from the ground, a spent shell, and pocketing it, the flames and smoke from an explosion. For those who gave evidence at the Commission of Inquiry, these are some of the very things they told the lawyers who then questioned whether they themselves saw these things, whether they could say for sure it was snipers and not gunmen on the rooftops, whether there really were mortars dropped in civilian residential areas of the community. We have walked back into the community proper through the hole in the outside walls, and we pass a park with a fountain. This park is iconic within archival footage of Tivoli Gardens, and when we ask about it, Annette lights up. "Let me give you a little bit about the ambiance," she says. "Mr. Seaga used to walk here with people your color skin every week." Here she's clearly referring to me and Diane, not Junior or Varun, and also not the white American students and cinematographer I've brought from the US. Uptown people, people who used to pass through the community with cameras. Annette painted a picture for us, the fountain flowing, the daylight filtered through tree branches, the sea breeze blowing, people sitting and kissing on the benches. Diane teased her about the kissing part, and she said she was too young at the time to be on the bench. After 1989, she said, all that stopped. We run into Joan McCarthy in front of the park. She had been too shaken up to come into the recording studio with us to talk about her experiences during the incursion, but she did ultimately give evidence in front of the Commission of Inquiry in December 2014. Joan's grandson was killed in her house, shot in front of her. She was asked to find a sheet, which was then used to wrap his body as he was dragged out of the apartment and down the steps outside. She begins telling us this, and Annette takes over, remembering that she could hear him telling the police with a Yankee accent, "My peoples is in the States. My mom is in the States." Because he was a foreigner, Annette said, he didn't know how to beg for his life. He never should have died, Joan said. He had been due to fly out in April. While the West Kingston Commission of Inquiry was critical to a national and diasporic discussion of how sovereign violence has been generated and the institutions through which it is and has been enacted, its denouement did not ultimately transform the lives of those who lost loved ones or were themselves injured within Tivoli Gardens, even though some people were compensated monetarily for damage to property, and even though the government ultimately issued an apology to the community. This did not suddenly enable Annette to revel in the company of her nephews, whom she currently avoids because they remind her of her sister's death. Nor is it what ultimately stopped Sean from beginning his morning with white rum. It could not, as community members say, bring back life, either literally or metaphorically. This is because the Commission, and others like it, was a juridical solution that relied on a liberal humanist conception of rights and morality that merely produces the juridical and economic subjects it presupposes without fundamentally transforming their material, social, or symbolic circumstances. It's also because truth commissions and other inquiries require for their realization that we imagine ourselves to exist in a post-violence, post-conflict moment, rather than encouraging us to interrogate the forms of historical and everyday violence that create the conditions for these kinds of spectacular eruptions. What is required is a more robust sense of ethics and justice, of accountability and responsibility, of recognition. Annette is viewing a draft of the film with us, and she watches herself walking, pointing, turning. The camera is behind her, tracking her movements beside the empty field, down Bustamante Highway. She's watching herself from behind, and at one point she turns to face the camera. In the street that day, I remember she turned because she was concerned that some of our crew had splintered off, and she wanted to make sure we all stayed together. In the room watching, though, she startled. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that she thought she had been watching her sister walking, that it wasn't until she turned that she realized she was watching herself. This is surprising, given everything Annette has said about her sister, that she was significantly more petite, that even though she did domestic work, she always looked pulled together and wore spiky heels in and out of the community, and that, as Annette once said, she don't talk like me, she talks standard. But in that moment, watching the film, she saw her sister in her body. She didn't recognize herself. In the recording studio, Nadine tells us that when she was called to identify her nephew Sheldon, one of the two nephews she raised who were killed in the incursion, she could barely recognize him. His body was burned so badly, the police had to ask her if he had any marks. Him have a cut on him left foot, she said. Him have a chipped teeth. And upon him right side, him have a birthmark. That is how they identified him in death, through the intimate knowledge gleaned through a lifetime of love and care. What were made legible in 2010 were the various scales at which and through which the garrison operates. In other words, the garrison doesn't merely denote a physical space, one that is simultaneously local, national, and global, but also affects an affective disposition encompassing the requirement of submission to a set of dictating norms and forms of violence that include the suspension of critical consciousness, the simultaneous denigration of blackness and its celebration in popular culture, the violent policing of movement, and the need to appeal to a leader for the provision of basic requirements. This is why other modalities of organizing political life and social development, like Rastafari, or like the People's Freedom Movement, or the Black Power movement, have been seen as and subdued as threats, not only to Jamaican sovereignty and US hegemony, but also to the worldview that positions Black bodies as the instruments of profit, economic, cultural, and political, for others. How do we address the question of what it means to be a human capable of acting in and on a world that hides the ontological entanglements of the violences that have been foundational to its formation? How do we generate what Denise Ferreira da Silva has termed affectability, that which is necessary to the process of the project of recognition and thus of repair? The effects of violence must be measured not merely in terms of numbers, persons dead, dwellings razed, but vis-a-vis the structural, qualitative, and affective dimensions of experience in order to challenge the ontological notions of temporality, causality, and mutual responsibility that have become naturalized. What would this look like, feel like, for people in post-incursion Tivoli Gardens? What could this look like, feel like, for all of us? Thank you.
So I think we have a few minutes for questions, and there is someone with a microphone over to your left. On that side. Kelly?
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you all for starting us off today for our last day of the conference with some great food for thought. I wanted to bring up something that I've been thinking about since yesterday, which Professor Fullilove brought up, but which I think can be addressed to everybody on the panel, which is the idea of translation in terms of just thinking about how we speak across places and time in more places in a kind of Black diaspora conceptual space. I think, usually if we're doing this here or people are doing it in France, wherever, or in Brazil, or in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, languages will keep us apart, but I'm wondering how people think we can engage this going forward in terms of the type of diasporic conversations that we need to have. And Professor Hooker brought it up yesterday in terms of how we access Brazil, or how Brazilians even access an Afro-Latino history, and also speaking about Haiti today as well. So I wonder what you all might think about that.
Well, I'll start since you said my name. The panel that we had was led by translation scholars who were concerned that the documents of the Haitian Revolution were in English and French, but not Creole. But that even when they translated them into Creole as a written language, people in the schools are not taught to read Creole, they're taught to read French. So they can't read the Creole. So then what they needed to do was not only to translate it into Creole, but to have it read. So I think the problems they're not insurmountable, but they're major and very little recognized. So how we begin to say that, how we begin to manage that, I think is really something we have to start working with. One of the things that we're doing is trying to get our call for observance translated into as many languages as we can find people to translate. So I think we have to begin to tackle the fact that there are many languages.
For me, diaspora is a relation, and in some ways, therefore, also a reading practice, which kind of harks back to the beginning panel of yesterday. It requires a real and serious engagement with non-US, obviously, genealogies and histories, and really an attempt to move beyond the kind of moment of discovery of similarities, and instead to think through our spaces, I think, as different nodes within this broader process of modernity. So there are certain kinds of frames that encompass the experiences that we all have, but of course, these would have to, these articulate differently. So I guess I wouldn't think of it as a process of translation as much as, except in the literal ways that Mindy's talking about, and that that Juliet raised yesterday about how women are often translated into English less frequently than male scholars. But more just a commitment to the engagement in another legacy, another genealogy. The work.
Do you have any other? Yes, in the front. They're going to bring you a microphone because I think this is being recorded.
Thank you for the wealth of information that you've brought to us this Saturday morning. It's all-encompassing and inclusive, from everything to the chemicals that we take into our body and digest, from your Professor Brown's presentation of the rent parties and the hog maul and the chitlins and the liquor that was digested, and aligning that to the number of knifings that went on at these rent parties. And all the way to the other end, to Professor Thomas's presentation of the chemicals that was put on our skins. I never noticed it that much in Jamaica, but in Nigeria and in Ghana and in Australia, I recently noticed that people are bleaching their skin. Would you put, and in your narration, you aligned it with self-hate, and I'm wondering if it's more of self or racial hate, since it can be sawn throughout the diaspora. Just wondering how you think about the chemicals that we intake and those that we put on our skin. Can you answer that?
Sure. I didn't identify it as a process of racial self-hatred personally, but many people do. I would agree with those scholars who see it as a somewhat more complex process of self-representation that one could see in relation not only to sort of dominant structures of inequality related to, modernity, but also as a form of play and performance, which is, alluding to Krista Thompson's work and Winnie Glaude-Brown and Kezia Page, who have all sort of tried to think in somewhat more complex ways about what it means to do different things with skin and bodies, and how we might see that as a different form of representation.
I don't know that I have a full answer for your question. I mean, one of the things that is interesting to me about the kinds of lists that get produced in certain kind of accounts of the rent party, that this happens and this happens. Again, it's to try to suggest that the rent party has a form, right, or all the things that others that sometimes get taken as chaos, right, or even the bedlam that Reed kind of talks about, that it's all part of beats that you hit at the party, right? And the food is so important. The liquor is so important, right? That in this investment that I'm interested in thinking more about in terms of appetite, that and so many kind of representations of the rent party, that appetite is so important, right? This kind of voraciousness that's part of how people describe the party. Voraciousness for food, for liquor, for people, for dancing, for movement, for losing the self, right? It's a voraciousness for filling the body, but also for being disoriented. And I think that's what time and time again people are trying to capture in those representations, right? And both in relationship to what you referenced in terms of the violence, right? I've been really, in thinking about this project, been trying to grapple with how not to romanticize the rent party while still kind of thinking about what's being generated there. And I kind of realized, like, I don't have to do that work. That's constantly what the writers and musicians themselves are doing, right? It's kind of measuring and balancing the danger and the ways that people are getting hurt and killed at rent parties, but also that's not the only thing, right? Or the ways that the kind of jealousness, the possessiveness is what produces the violence at the rent party, right? And this interest in the kind of non-possessiveness that's also kind of being balanced out at the rent party. So really trying to think about all these different things that are a part of it, and paying attention to the ways that people are trying to describe all of those elements at once, and not trying to come up with some sort of ultimate reading of it, right? Or ultimate, assign an ultimate value of it. Fred Moten talks about the indeterminate, the kind of line between riot and party and strike, and I think there's something happening there in the ways that people are trying to get a hold on what the rent party is.
There's a fascinating obituary in today's New York Times which relates. It's sort of the obituary of Michael Tesco, who started a number of gay clubs in the 70s up to the present. And the parallel, I think, is of young people pouring into the city. So the people who are migrating are basically young, and they didn't come with their parents and their grandparents. And so there's this sort of, Lord of the Flies moment where people make their own way. Anyway, I think it's an interesting parallel, because the gay men are certainly coming without their parents and grandparents, and they make a lot of parties that are pretty wild.
Parties.
I first just want to thank you for this panel, and I had a couple of questions and then just a comment. One, for Professor Brown, I was wondering if you have come across anything. I mean, we have discussions of the rent parties and those great cards that Langston Hughes collected. Have you come across anything about, I think this would be in the same category as the rent parties, but of a practice of selling plates or selling dinners that I recall as a practice that women did in poor urban communities. I'm trying to be objective and not say my own community, but it was, it was out of economic necessity, but also people really, it just reminds me of something that comes out of the legacy of the rent party, and then you could, maybe you didn't have to cook that night because so-and-so is selling plates. So I'm wondering if you saw any evidence of that. And then Professor Matsipa, I was just fascinated with so much of what all of you were doing, but there was something you said that I was hoping you could elaborate on a little bit more. You talked about, I'm not going to get it right because I didn't write the full quotation, but you talked about African cities kind of emerging out of projects of either development, like projects of development, or humanitarianism, which you see as kind of foreclosing a certain kind of engagement in a future, a sense of futurity. Or I might be wrong, but could you talk about that a little more? And then finally, Professor Fullilove, we at IRAAS and at ADS are doing a 1619 program on September 26th. So I'd love to add that to your listing. And I like the word, I think you I think you called it commemoration. Is that the word you used?
Observance.
Observance. Because we've been struggling with what to call it. We're like, it's not a celebration. We don't want to call it an anniversary, but observance I like a lot. So thank you for that. Okay.
We had the same struggle.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the question. I've been thinking about what kinds of conversations are made possible by thinking, as somebody who's located on the African continent and in African Academy, what it means to think of myself in developmental and humanitarian terms, and what the implications of those two registers are for a kind of radical political imagination. And I think that both humanitarianism and developmentalism are part of a kind of liberal project that presupposes a subject whose desire is to be integrated into this idea of convergence with some kind of norm that's established outside of that reality. And what I also feel from being privileged enough to visit many of the cities that were part of the Mobilities project is that there's so many African spatial forms and spatial practices that exceed the theoretical limits that developmentalism frames. And so that's why I switch back and forth between a kind of futurism and deep histories of African urbanism, because there are examples in pre-colonial African urbanism that are non-hierarchical, that are networked, that can accommodate hypermobile populations and also sedentary populations simultaneously. And this kind of understanding of African spatiality in deep time doesn't exist within those bodies of knowledge. So my education in African architecture and urbanism really starts 400 years ago in terms of like an institutional colonial education, but it's only when you kind of begin to do this time travel, time bending work that I understand that there's like conceptual and spatial richness in thinking through these spaces differently, and that in connecting with these deep histories, it creates possibilities for imagining different kinds of futures or different kinds of trajectories. And also demand, one of the conversations I have with my students at GSAP, for instance, is like, why are you speculating about the future? Why do you have fantasies when you don't have running water? But I think that it's important to defend our right to imagine the future in our own terms and in vocabularies and ways that are aligned with who we want to become, as opposed to living in somebody else's dream, which is largely what many Black people, whether we are on this side of the Atlantic or the other, have to contend with.
May I say a word about the selling plates question, which is really great. I haven't seen that term. But what I have seen is attempts to kind of different kinds of parties. So the rent party, kind of where you have cards and you're inviting people you don't know to come into the party, versus buffet flats. Buffet parties, which from my understanding were not so public. You had to kind of know to go to them. And I think in terms of, both the rent party and the buffet flat were associated with prostitution. Rent party less so, buffet flat much more so. So it was kind of food and sex work kind of combined in that space. But in both of those cases, it's people coming in to get the food, right? And I mean, the other thing that's interesting about this question is, when we look at the rent party cards, sometimes there's one person, sometimes there's two, occasionally there's three. But in the representations that I've seen looked at so far, the rent party is always a group affair in terms of planning, because so many people are usually living in the house, in their apartment, right? And so who's doing the food is never really a gendered role. Sometimes it's the patriarch in the family, sometimes it's the woman, sometimes it's someone younger, sometimes they get someone from outside to come in and do the food. And the way that all of those roles, that all the genres or the conventions that are part of the rent party get kind of put together in a communal fashion, just as the kind of party itself is communal as well. But I'll keep looking. If I see it, I'm going to let you know.
Great. And I think with that, we'll end this morning panel. But thank you. And I think we will convene back here at 1:15 for our next panel on global Black feminism. So thank you.
Thank you.